My wife lied and said she was going to her mother's house, but I followed her. I don't know how to explain what made me suspicious. Maybe it was the way she avoided my eyes before leaving, the rush to get her keys, or the sudden coldness in the last few months. Something inside me said there was something wrong, a primitive instinct that screamed at me not to accept that excuse without question. So I did something I never imagined I would do. I waited a few minutes and went after her. The journey was short, but every second seemed like an eternity. My heart was pounding, my mind was oscillating between trying to rationalize the situation and accepting that maybe I was exaggerating. Maybe she was actually going to her mother's house. Maybe it was all in my head. But when I saw her car turning a corner that didn't lead to her mother-in-law's house, when I saw her park in front of an unfamiliar building, my stomach dropped. I knew I was about to discover something that would change my life forever. She got out of the car without hesitation, without looking around, without fear of being seen. This infuriated me even more. How naturally she did it, as if there was nothing wrong, as if there wasn't a husband at home who trusted her blindly. My breathing became heavy as I watched her cross the sidewalk and enter the building. Seconds later, the door opened again. A man came out. He was waiting for her. I don't know how to describe the pain of seeing your wife smiling at another man the way she once smiled at you. To see her body lean slightly towards him, like she did to me at the beginning of our relationship. I saw it happening before my eyes and, for the first time in a long time, I felt an anger that burned every part of my body. I picked up the cell phone. My hands were shaking so much I almost dropped them. But I needed to record it. I needed this to be real. Because a part of me was still trying to deny it, still trying to convince myself that maybe it was something else. But it wasn't. The photo was taken at the exact moment her lips brushed his. An image that would remain forever etched in my mind. I could have walked away at that moment. I could have kept it to myself, confronted my wife at home and resolved it another way. But no. Something inside me screamed that this couldn't go unpunished. She needed to feel the weight of what she did. She needed to be exposed. And I did. I spread it to everyone. Friends, family, social networks. I made a point of showing the world who she really was. I made sure to destroy her the same way she destroyed our life together. The reaction was instantaneous. The messages started to arrive, the phone calls, the comments. The shock, the indignation. Absolute silence on her part. But what came next? I didn't expect that. I didn't expect my wife to try to reverse the situation in such a vile way. I didn't expect her to use the same lies she told to cheat to try to free herself from the guilt. I didn't expect her to look me in the eyes, with tears that seemed real, and say it was all a mistake. That I was the love of her life. That it didn't mean anything. But her words sounded empty. As if they had been rehearsed. As if she knew the only chance she had was to make me doubt what I saw with my own eyes. And then, just when I thought I had control of the situation, when I believed the truth was out and that my revenge had been enough, something happened. Something that completely changed the game. Something that made me realize that, despite all the pain, all the betrayal, all the anger, I still didn't know everything. And the truth, when it finally came out, was even worse than I could have imagined. Now, tell me, what does someone do when they discover that betrayal was just the tip of the iceberg? That there is something much bigger hidden behind everything? That, in the end, I was just a pawn in a game she had been playing for a long time. Welcome to the channel. Here, the betrayal it is neither romanticized nor justified. Every story you hear is fictional, but it carries an undeniable truth: betrayal destroys lives. The objective is to show the devastating consequences of those who choose this path. Get ready for a story shocking, intense and unforgettable. Sit down, take a deep breath, and listen until the end. The first years of marriage between Daniel and Laura were like a dream. There was complicity in every gesture, passion in every touch and affection in every look. It was the kind of love that made anyone jealous, the kind of relationship that seemed unshakable, one that resists time, difficulties, the natural changes of life. They met at college, both young and full of plans, with the absolute certainty that they were made for each other. The harmony between them was evident to anyone who watched them together, as if they were two pieces of a puzzle that fit together perfectly. The wedding took place right after graduation, a simple but emotional ceremony, full of promises said between tears and smiles, promises that seemed unbreakable. Time passed, and life followed its natural course. Daniel began to dedicate himself more to his career, climbing step by step in the corporate world. His intelligence and ambition made him a respected professional, someone who always sought more, who was never satisfied with what he had already achieved. Laura, on the other hand, was more of a free spirit. From an early age, her love of art led her to build a career as a designer, a job that allowed her to express her creativity and gave her the freedom she valued so much. While Daniel followed rigid schedules, endless commitments and endless meetings, Laura worked at her own pace, often from home, surrounded by canvases and brushes that added color to her world. At first, this difference between them seemed irrelevant. Daniel admired Laura's lightness, the way she saw the world with shining eyes, as if every detail of life was a work of art. And Laura saw Daniel as a safe haven, someone who had his feet firmly on the ground, who planned the future with precision and who always made her feel protected. But little by little, small cracks began to appear in this seemingly perfect relationship. Romantic dinners started to be replaced by lonely nights, where Laura waited for Daniel with the food getting cold on the table, looking at her cell phone without receiving any warning messages. He always had an excuse, a meeting that took longer than expected, a client that needed extra attention, an urgent project that couldn't wait. And Laura tried to understand, because that's what couples did, right? They supported each other, adapted, understood the difficult phases. But something inside her began to change. There was an emptiness growing in her chest, an uncomfortable feeling that she couldn't quite name. The feeling of being alone, even when Daniel was by her side, became more and more frequent. And no matter how much she tried to ignore it, no matter how much she tried to convince herself that it was just a phase, a part of her knew that something had changed between them. Conversations that were once lively became short, full of automatic responses and uncomfortable silences. Daniel seemed distracted, always with his head somewhere else, and Laura found herself questioning whether he was really listening to what she was saying or just pretending to pay attention. The few nights they were together were marked by a mechanical intimacy, without the warmth of before, without the looks that said more than words. Laura wondered if it was normal for desire to diminish over time, if every couple went through this or if it was just a reflection of the distance that grew between them. She tried to talk to him, tried to express her insecurities, but she always received the same answer: it was just a phase, the work was demanding a lot from him, but everything would return to normal soon. But that soon never arrived. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and Laura began to feel like a disposable piece in Daniel's life. She knew he loved her, knew that deep down he was still the same man she married, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through her fingers. Their house, once full of laughter and lively conversation, now seemed too big, too quiet. The sofa where they used to curl up to watch movies has become an empty space. The bedroom that was once a refuge of intimacy and complicity has become just a place to sleep. And then, without realizing it, Laura started looking for small distractions. She went out more with her friends, dedicated herself more to work, tried to occupy her mind so as not to think too much. She tried to fill the emptiness she felt, find something that would make her feel alive again. But nothing seemed enough. Daniel's words were still there, but his touch was not. He still said, "I love you," before leaving the house, but the words seemed to be spoken automatically, without the passion he had before. And so, without either of them realizing it, something essential was lost between them. It didn't happen overnight, there wasn't a big fight, nor a specific moment when everything fell apart. It was a slow and silent erosion, a wear and tear that happened little by little, without fanfare. One day, they woke up and realized that they were no longer the same. That they were side by side, but not together. Who still shared the same roof, but no longer the same connection. The pain of this realization was different for each of them. Daniel felt that Laura was distant, but he didn't know how to bring her back. Work had always been his priority, but now he wondered if he had overdone it, if he had neglected what really mattered. Laura, on the other hand, tried to understand when she stopped feeling wanted, loved, needed. When did your marriage start to feel like a contract instead of a love story? But fate, relentless as always, had already set the pieces in motion. And neither of them knew they were about to reach the point of no return. The weeks passed and the routine took its course, but something hung in the air like a storm about to break. Daniel felt that Laura was increasingly distant, although he tried to ignore this discomfort, throwing himself into work like a man who refuses to see the crack in the structure of his house. He arrived late, left early, filled his mind with numbers, meetings and strategies. Deep down, he knew that things between them were no longer the same, but he convinced himself that it was just a phase, a natural cycle of a long marriage. However, Laura did not seem to share this same illusion. Laura, in turn, tried to hide the frustration that was growing inside her, suffocating her every day. She felt invisible. The lonely nights, the uncomfortable silences, the absence of touch, all of that started to weigh more than it should have. For the first few months, she clung to the hope that Daniel would notice, that one day he would walk through the door and look into her eyes and tell her he missed who they were. But that never happened. He seemed increasingly distant, immersed in his own world, and Laura began to wonder if there was still room for her there. It was then that he appeared. At first, he was just a coworker. Someone with whom I exchanged casual conversations about projects, ideas and trends in the area. But unlike Daniel, he paid attention. He noticed the small details, oscillating between discreet compliments and comments that made her smile without realizing it. He made her feel seen. And this detail, so small and at the same time so significant, was enough to create something dangerous, an almost imperceptible gap that soon turned into an abyss. She tried to ignore it. She tried to tell herself it was just innocent flirting, that it meant nothing. But the way your heart raced when you received a message from him, the way you caught yourself looking at your phone waiting for contact, revealed that it was getting out of your control. There was a desire pulsing there, something she hadn't felt in a long time. And over time, the guilt began to dissolve. She felt abandoned by Daniel, neglected, as if her existence within that marriage was just a formality. So why should you feel guilty about wanting to be desired again? The meetings began as mere casual lunches, perfect excuses that did not arouse suspicion. But what was supposed to be innocent soon turned into something more. The subtle touches became lingering, the looks full of intentions became impossible to ignore. And then, it happened. What she told herself she would never do, what she always condemned in other people, what she never imagined would one day be part of her story, became real. The first time was a whirlwind of emotions. As their lips met and their clothes fell apart, there was a part of her screaming that this was wrong, that crossing that line was a path of no return. But the other part, the one that was tired of waiting, tired of feeling empty, just gave in. And when it was all over, when the bodies finally separated, what came was not guilt but a strange relief. As if, for a few moments, she had felt alive again. She thought it would end there, that she could pretend it never happened and move on with her life. But it's not over. What started as a slip became a habit, a need that grew with each encounter. Over time, Laura became another person, someone who knew how to lie naturally, who smiled at Daniel while hiding messages on her cell phone, who lay next to her husband at night still feeling the scent of another man on her skin. And somehow none of it felt wrong. She justified to herself that Daniel pushed her into this, that he was the one who allowed this to happen by neglecting her. But deep down, I knew I was just trying to lighten the weight of what I was doing. Daniel, oblivious to the reality unfolding before his eyes, still clung to the idea that everything was fine. But he began to notice changes in Laura that he couldn't explain. The different smell on her clothes, the evasive answers when he asked about her day, the furtive glances at her cell phone. Little things, almost imperceptible details, but which, when added together, formed a disturbing image. And then, something happened that he didn't expect. That night, Laura said she was going to her mother's house. The justification was given casually, without any hesitation. He agreed, said it was okay, to enjoy the time with his mother. But when she walked out the door, an uneasiness grew inside him. Something was wrong. Something about the way she said it, how she held her bag too tightly, how she avoided looking at him directly. Impulsively, he grabbed his car keys and decided to follow her. He tried to tell himself that he was being paranoid, that he was exaggerating, but the truth was that he needed to know. He needed to be sure that all this was nothing more than an error in his restless mind. He drove slowly, keeping enough distance to not be noticed. The path, initially, followed as expected. But then, on a corner, Laura did something that chilled her blood. She turned in the wrong direction. Mother's house was on the other side. He felt his heart racing, his breathing getting heavier. Still, he continued. She parked in front of a building he didn't recognize. He stayed there for a few seconds, checking his phone, as if waiting for confirmation. And then he got out of the car. He watched everything with his fingers tight on the steering wheel. He was still trying to convince himself that there was an explanation, that maybe this was a mistake. But when the door to the building opened and a man appeared, smiling at Laura in a way no friend would, Daniel knew. The world around him fell silent. He watched as the two of them approached, as she touched his face with familiarity, as their lips met without hesitation. The impact of that scene was overwhelming. For a moment, he couldn't move. All I could do was look. It was then that he picked up his cell phone. His heart was pounding in his chest, his vision seemed blurred. He knew it would change everything. But I needed to register. I needed to have proof. He needed that scene to be immortalized, because part of him still refused to believe it. The photo was taken at the exact moment Laura was giving in to the kiss. And in that moment, Daniel knew that nothing would ever be the same. Daniel felt his heart beating hard in his chest, as if it could explode at any moment. His breathing was short, almost non-existent, while his eyes stared at the cell phone screen, the image recorded there being irrefutable proof that everything he feared was real. The betrayal was before him, documented, embedded in his mind like a well-aimed blow. The pain was suffocating, as if he had been punched in the stomach and the air had simply gone from his lungs. His world, which had already been fragmenting little by little, was finally collapsing for good. He wanted to scream, he wanted to break the phone, he wanted to rip that man out of Laura's life and make her understand the extent of the destruction he had caused. But he didn't do any of that. He just took a deep breath, feeling the bitter taste of humiliation in his mouth, and began to plan. The initial shock was replaced by a calculated coldness, an intense desire for her to pay for everything she did. He wouldn't let this go. I wouldn't allow him to get away with it. The betrayal wasn't just a breach of trust, it was a blow to her dignity, her history, everything he had built alongside her. In the following days, he maintained silence. Laura didn't show the slightest suspicion that anything had changed. He continued to arrive late some nights, making up excuses that he had previously believed without hesitation. But now her every word was a sharp blade cutting through his self-control. He was just waiting for the right moment to act. And then, the opportunity arose. It was a night like any other. Laura said she would spend some time at her mother's house and Daniel just agreed, keeping his expression neutral. But instead of waiting patiently like he always did, he acted. With all the photos and videos of the betrayal saved, he began to spread the truth. First, he sent it to family members, then to close friends, until the news began to circulate. It didn't take long for the repercussions to take on uncontrollable proportions. When Laura finally found out, her reaction was exactly as he imagined. She entered the house upset, her eyes wide, her face pale as if she had just seen a ghost. She screamed, asking how he could do that, how he had the courage to expose his life like that. But Daniel just smiled, watching every slight expression of despair on her face. She said that it was an exaggeration, that they could resolve it between them, that he didn't need to have destroyed her reputation. But her words no longer meant anything. And then came the final blow. Among the countless messages he received after exposing the betrayal, one of them caught his attention. A message coming from an unknown number, containing a photo. A photo of the man Laura cheated on him with, alongside a woman. But not just any woman. His wife. The shock hit Daniel with the force of a runaway train. That man wasn't just any lover. He was also married. And more than that, there was a detail that turned everything into something even more devastating. Laura's lover's wife was not a stranger. She was someone close. Someone who was always around. Daniel's blood ran cold as he understood what that meant. Laura didn't just cheat on him. She was deceived in the same way. The man she gave herself to, who made her believe she was special, who made empty promises, was a double traitor. And now, with everything exposed, she was about to feel the weight of humiliation firsthand. Daniel waited until Laura finished her performance, until she used every possible excuse, until she desperately tried to make him feel guilty for exposing her. Then, with the same calm he used to plot his revenge, he picked up his phone and opened the photo he had received. He threw his cell phone on the table, causing the screen to glow in front of her eyes. The silence that followed was deafening. Laura's eyes widened, her face losing all trace of color. His lips trembled, as if he was trying to form a word, but nothing came out. Daniel crossed his arms and just watched. The shock, the disbelief, the pain. She looked at the screen as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. The wife of the man she was involved with. Someone she knew. That I trusted. The ground beneath his feet seemed to have disappeared. And for the first time, she felt exactly what Daniel felt when he discovered her betrayal. The bitter taste of disappointment. The cutting pain of double betrayal. She wasn't the only victim of her own lie. She too had been deceived. Laura felt her legs weaken. The cell phone was still on the table, the screen glowing as if it was burning your skin. Her eyes darted frantically across the image, as if she could somehow alter what she saw, as if she could erase the raw, merciless truth that had been thrown in her face. But there was no escape. Here was the reality she couldn't deny, proof that she wasn't the only one playing with fire, that she herself had been deceived in such a brutal way that her betrayal now seemed small in the face of the devastating scenario unfolding before her. The man for whom she risked everything, for whom she lied, hid, betrayed, was as much of a traitor as she was. The silence in the room was piercing. Daniel, sitting in front of her, watched her as if waiting for her to digest everything. There was no rush. There was no need for hasty words. He wanted to see. I wanted to watch the exact moment when Laura understood that everything she built with that man was a sham. A game that she thought she was winning, but that, in the end, left her stripped of any dignity. She tried to speak, tried to form some sentence, but her voice broke. His hands were shaking, his breathing was erratic. The weight of her own stupidity crushed her. Her gaze met Daniel's, and for the first time since it all began, she saw something different in him. It wasn't just suppressed anger, it wasn't just silent contempt. There was a cold, detached look, as if he had already made a decision and was just waiting for the moment to put it into practice. The man she betrayed now stood before her, watching her fall with disturbing calm. He didn't shout, he didn't insult her, he didn't demand explanations. He just handed the truth to her the same way she did to him, without mercy. The seconds seemed to drag by. Laura took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, her expression was different. Even though she was devastated, even though she was shocked, she tried to regain some control over the situation. She couldn't allow him to see her broken, to realize how deeply it hit her. But Daniel noticed. She opened her mouth, ready for a new excuse, for a new psychological game, but he was faster. His voice cut through the room like a sharp blade, without hesitation, without room for argument. He wanted to know if she felt satisfied, if everything was worth it, if what she found in another man's arms was so good as to justify everything she threw away. He wanted to know if at least now, faced with complete ruin, she could see what she had done. Laura tried to argue, tried to say that it wasn't that simple. But Daniel laughed. A dry laugh, without any trace of humor. For him, that was simple. She made a choice. And now he was reaping the consequences of it. With each of his words, she felt her world crumbling a little more. And the worst of all was knowing that there was no one to blame but herself. But she still tried. She tried to deflect the blame, tried to say that she felt neglected, that she was just looking for something that would make her feel alive again. And it was then that Daniel stood up. He didn't want to hear anything else. For him, all that was already resolved. She was no longer the woman he loved, she was no longer the person he once chose to share his life with. Now, he was just someone who made a bad choice and was suffering the consequences of it. Laura realized that she was losing, that he wasn't there to forgive her or to give her a chance to explain herself. He was there to finish it all. To put an end to that story. Despair took over her. She tried to get closer, tried to touch his arm, tried to make him look at her differently. But Daniel's look was that of someone who had been gone a long time ago. She begged, saying they could start over, that they could get over it. But he didn't respond. He just took the keys, opened the door and left. And at that moment, Laura knew there was no going back. She didn't just destroy the marriage. She destroyed the only man who truly cared about her. The man who, despite everything, was still able to get out of there with his dignity intact, leaving behind the mess he created. And it was only when the door closed behind him that the tears fell. Because now, finally, she understood. She had lost everything. Daniel left without looking back. The cold night air bit into his skin, but he felt nothing but the crushing weight of what had just happened. He walked aimlessly, his steps firm on the asphalt, while his mind was still trying to process the whirlwind of events that had unfolded so quickly. The humiliation, the anger, the betrayal, it was all there, mixed together, making it impossible to think clearly. He didn't have a defined destination, he just knew that he couldn't stay in that house for another second. With every corner he turned, his chest felt heavier, the lump in his throat more and more suffocating. His steps took him to a dimly lit bar, one of those discreet places where people go to forget the world for a few hours. He entered, sitting on one of the benches in the far corner. The bartender didn't ask any questions, just poured a full glass of whiskey as soon as he saw Daniel's blank expression. The liquid burned his throat, but he didn't care. That bitter taste matched everything he felt. Laura, meanwhile, remained motionless in the living room, her eyes fixed on the door that was now closed. The feeling of emptiness was unbearable. He tried to take a deep breath, but it felt like all the air in the room had been sucked out. His heart was beating wildly, and his mind was spinning in a chaotic whirlwind of thoughts. She wanted to run after him, she wanted to beg him not to leave her, she wanted to say that they could still find a way, but deep down, she knew it was already too late. The penny was falling with torturous slowness. Every detail of what had happened in the last few days, every word spoken, every choice made, everything played out in his head like a movie that couldn't be paused. He felt a bitter taste in his mouth as he realized that not only had he lost Daniel, but he had lost the only stability he had in his life. Her mistake, her decisions, brought her here. She never imagined that she would be able to throw everything away so easily, but now, surrounded by the piercing silence of the house, she realized that there were no more excuses. Daniel took another sip of whiskey, feeling the drink warm his body, but not ease his mind. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He closed his eyes for a moment before picking it up. He didn't want to see, but at the same time, curiosity consumed him. It was Laura. He stared at the screen for a few seconds, his fingers gripping the device tightly. Did you want to serve her? Did you want to hear your voice at that moment? He didn't know. Everything seemed too confusing. But before he could decide, the vibration stopped. A second later, another notification. Forgive me. Please forgive me. I don't know what to do. He let out a humorless laugh. Didn't know what to do. Now that everything was lost, now that there was no turning back, she didn't know what to do. His chest filled with anger, but there was something deeper there. Absolute tiredness. He didn't want to argue anymore. I didn't want to hear any more explanations. I just wanted distance. The phone vibrated again. This time, a phone call. He watched the screen flicker, fingers hesitant before swiping to answer. He put the device to his ear and remained silent. On the other side, a shaky sigh. Daniel. Her voice was full of despair, choked with emotion. He remained silent. Please talk to me. I know I messed up. I know I destroyed everything, but I need to see you. I need to try to fix this. He took a deep breath, squeezing his eyes shut as if that could lessen the pain. To repair. His voice was low, but full of irony. And how exactly do you plan to fix that, Laura? She sobbed on the other side. I don't know. I just know that I can't lose you. I can't live without you. I feel empty. Empty. He laughed again, but this time there was bitterness in the laugh. Do you feel empty right now? And when did you decide you needed another man to fill that void? Did you think about that? Silence. He shook his head, taking another sip of the whiskey before continuing. Laura, it's over. No. She interrupted quickly. Don't say that. It can't end like this. We've been through so much together, we love each other. You can't just throw it all away like that. I didn't throw anything away. His voice was now cold, sharp. You were the one who did this. She started crying on the other side, but he felt nothing but exhaustion. I don't know how I was able to do this to you, she murmured. I was confused, I was lost. I thought you didn't see me anymore, that you didn't care. But I was wrong. My God, I was so wrong. Yes. You made a mistake. And now you have to live with it. The pain in her voice was evident, but he could no longer care. For so long, he was the man who would forgive her, who would try to understand, who would make room for a second chance. But not anymore. He hung up the call without saying anything else. Laura was left with the phone still pressed to her ear, the crying coming in uncontrollable waves. You've never felt so much pain before. You never thought it would get to this point. But there she was, alone, staring into the emptiness of a house that was no longer a home. Meanwhile, Daniel finished his glass and signaled the bartender for another. But deep down, I knew alcohol wouldn't bring relief. He knew he still had a long way to go, that the scars from this story would remain for a while. But there, that night, in that forgotten bar in the middle of the city, one thing was certain. He wouldn't go back to Laura. Never again. The days that followed were a blur for Laura. The silence inside the house was deafening, every corner a reminder of Daniel's absence. The nights were the worst. She couldn't sleep, she couldn't eat, she couldn't think about anything other than his expression when he showed her the truth she tried so hard to ignore. It was an emptiness that seemed to devour her from the inside out. He tried to call again, he tried to send messages, he even tried to show up at his work, but all his attempts were ignored. Daniel had closed the door, locked it with all the keys and thrown away any possibility of returning. She no longer existed in his world. And that was exactly what he deserved. The gazes of the people around him were like blades. Mutual friends avoided contact, the family moved away. Her own mother, who was once her refuge, could not hide the disgust in her voice when she said that she no longer knew who her daughter had become. The lover, the one who promised so much, who fed her illusions so much, disappeared. It disappeared as if it had never existed, as if it was all just a delirium from which she had finally awakened. He tried to confront him, sought answers, but found only contempt. He didn't need her anymore. Never needed it. She was just another, a disposable piece in a dirty game that should never have started. She lost everything. The husband. The trust of the people around you. The respect. His reputation was destroyed, and no matter how much he tried to cling to some shred of dignity, there was none. All he had was the weight of his own conscience, the suffocating regret and the certainty that he would never get back what he destroyed with his own hands. Meanwhile, Daniel moved on. The first few days were difficult, but anger served as fuel. He threw himself into his work, occupied his mind, cut any ties that tied him to the past. He returned the house keys, signed the divorce papers without hesitation and moved on without looking back. The pain was still there, of course. Some nights were still heavy, but he refused to be swallowed up by what happened. I knew I deserved more. He knew that the future still had something in store for him. And the future has arrived. Not in the way I expected, but at the right time. It was on an ordinary afternoon, in a random cafe, when a casual conversation with someone unexpected turned into something more. At first, it didn't matter. He didn't want to repeat the mistakes of the past, he didn't want to throw himself headlong into something he wasn't ready to deal with. But that woman was different. I didn't try to fill a void, I didn't try to be a replacement, I didn't try to force him to feel something he didn't feel. It was just there. Over time, he realized that the conversations were easy, that the smiles were genuine, that her company was something he hadn't expected, but that, little by little, he began to desire. And then he realized he was ready. Ready to start over. To feel something true again. To leave the past where it belonged. Laura found out about his new life through rumors. He didn't want to know, but he couldn't help it. He heard about the new woman beside him, about how different he seemed, lighter, happier. And it killed her inside. The worst punishment wasn't being left behind. The worst punishment was knowing that he had moved on, that he had found happiness without her, that there was no more room for regret, that her time was up. And so, everyone went their own way. Him, for a new life. Her, for endless solitude. Now, I want to know your opinion. What did you think of this story? Do you believe that betrayal is forgivable or that some things just can't be fixed? Leave your comment, I want to know what you think. If you like this content, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new stories. Here, we show that betrayal always has a price and that no one leaves their choices unscathed. Until next time.